Hi there, welcome back to Ways of Reading. This is our series of conversations about the books we read in literature humanities, the flagship first year literature seminar in Columbia College at Columbia University. My name is Joseph Howley. I'm an associate professor in the classics department, and I'm the Paul Brook Program Chair, currently in charge of literature humanities. With me today is Professor Merve Emre. Professor Emre is a writer, a critic, a professor. She's a contributing writer to The New Yorker. You can find her essays and criticism basically anywhere you would want to find essays and criticism. She's the author of several books and more to come. And she's joining us today to talk about Anne Carson's translation of Sappho, If Not Winter, which is one of the first books we read in the fall semester of literature humanities. Professor Emre, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. This is exciting.
This I'm always excited to think about this book. Um, we like to say that this class is about first encounters with important books, books that have been important, books that might be important. And so I wanted to start by asking you, do you remember your first encounter with Anne Carson's Sappho?
I do. Back when the social media platform currently known as X was known as Twitter, there was a Twitter bot called the Sappho bot, which was programmed to tweet out fragments from If Not Winter. And there was a stretch of time when I was on Twitter when all I did really was follow different bots. So I was following that one. I was following the In Search of Lost Time bot, another favorite. There was a Ulysses bot, and of course the Virginia and Vita bot. But I thought that the Sappho bot was in many ways my favorite because it wasn't taking a long and already purportedly intact text like a novel and segmenting it and then tweeting it out. It was taking what were already legible to us as fragments and tweeting them out. And there was something in that remediation of a text from 640 BC in the technology of the 21st century that I found incredibly appealing. Then I was asked by the New Yorker to interview Anne Carson. So I read not only If Not Winter, but everything she had ever written. And it was really, really interesting to me to see how her work as a translator, and specifically as a translator of Sappho, was then threaded through both her own poetry and her critical essays on the nature of love and desire, and a philosophical approach and a linguistic approach to thinking through these very human and I think very, for many of us, very, very urgent questions.
The idea of the fragment is one that's always fascinated me, and I think it stands out to us here in a course where we also read, say, Homer, right? We read all of the Iliad, and we can be more or less confident, despite the various mediations of the intervening centuries in the translation, that we are reading all of the Iliad. With Sappho's poetry, it's always unavailable to us in a form that we might imagine an ancient reader would have encountered. It's always already kind of in pieces. It's always already being put back together. And the being put back together is the work of scholars who work on the Greek. It's the work of the translator, and it's inevitably the work of us in the classroom. But it's always striking to me the way that Sappho arrives to us in pieces. You know, we use the word body, both of an author's body of work, right, and of our own bodies that we live in. And this is a poet and a collection of poetry that, on the one hand, I think seizes people with its immediacy and vividness, and yet is never quite all the way there in the way that we like to think, even if it's a fantasy, that other authors become all the way there for us in books.
Yeah, that fragmentation raises two questions. One that for me, I think of as aesthetic, and the other I think of as more technical, although the two are always related. The aesthetic question is one of my own reactions when I'm reading this. There are certain fragments that absolutely knock me over, and that I have a very, very strong reaction to, a strong sensory reaction to, and that I immediately want to begin to interpret. The kinds of critical protocols that I might use to read a novel like Ulysses, or the novels in Search of Lost Time, or a sonnet by Keats or Shakespeare, become activated by some of these fragments. But then those are interspersed with fragments to which I have no response whatsoever. They leave me completely cold. I don't know what, if anything, I'm supposed to make of them, and all I can do is stare.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same aesthetic response that I have sometimes when I visit ancient ruins in Turkey, which is where I'm from. And I know that what I'm beholding is something like the extraordinary preservation of the past, but I can't access it in any sensorial or emotional way. So the aesthetic response that we have to the fragments, I think, is incredibly interesting. And it took me a long time to stop thinking of the lack of response to certain fragments as a failure on my part. I think that actually is a kind of index of history and an appropriate response to the pastness of the work, to not respond to it immediately or intensely. And then the second thing that I always think of when we're thinking about fragments is the role of the translator. There's a really lovely translator's introduction that Carson writes to this edition. The notes that she provides in the back are fascinating to me, and I would really, really encourage people to read those carefully. In her translator's introduction, Carson makes a claim that as a translator, she believes that Sappho will come through clearly if she, as the translator, does her best to step aside and let the fragments, as it were, speak for themselves. But that is immediately shown to be a convenient kind of fiction when you actually begin reading the fragments and you realize how much work Carson is doing here in terms of punctuation, in terms of diction, in terms of lineation. The translator is everywhere in this, and we can only have the body of the work because of the suturing or the weaving that the translator herself is doing, even if she's pretending not to do it.
This is I want to look at a couple of poems now and keep thinking about this, but I just want to pull on one thread out of this and ask you to talk just for another minute or two about how you, as a critic, encounter anything in translation. Like, you've written a lot about modern novels that are published in translation. Is it possible or desirable to imagine that you are responding only to the kind of the text, as it were, the translated thing that's not what you're actually reading? These two figures are always sort of rotating in front of me when I'm reading Sappho, and I'm always thinking about, am I reading Sappho? Am I reading Carson?
Right. My friend Damien Searles, who's a wonderful, wonderful translator, has a book coming out called The Philosophy of Translation. And what he insists upon in that book is that you read a translation the way you read any other text, because that is how you do justice to the work of the translator. That is how you recognize that the translator is a writer, and that translation is a crafted act of writing. It is not merely a technical exercise. And the success of a translation doesn't turn on its one-to-one correspondence between the language of the original and the language of the translation, but rather on a whole aesthetic response that you have to reading it, the way that you would evaluate or respond to a work that was originally written in English. I find this incredibly persuasive for two reasons. One, because I think it reminds us, or it reveals to some of us, how much our ideas about translation come from the introductory foreign language class, where we spend a lot of our time saying, okay, well, here is the word for dog in Greek, or here's the word for dog in Latin or Spanish or French. And we take that ideology of one-to-one matching and we try to apply it to reading works in translation, but that's completely that's completely inadequate to the actual experience of reading any artwork. And two, I think it appropriately positions the labor of the translator as an aesthetic labor, not a menial or technical or auxiliary to the work of the actual great artist. And so to me, I like thinking about it as we are encountering something that is written, and these questions of accuracy are important for philologists, but they're not necessarily, or they're not as important for critics or students as they are for professional scholars.
This is something that our students, even though most of our students in this class quite understandably don't read ancient Greek, they have a chance to encounter this because we read both Homer's Iliad and Homer's Odyssey. And setting aside for the moment that there's probably not a person called Homer, that these texts are the work of many hands, they basically represent the same tradition, and we read them the same tradition and the same style of language, and we read them in two different modern translations. So our students have a chance to read the Iliad in one translation and the Odyssey in a different translation, and I think that that is helpful to sort of open this door for us and see that there's that's even something as readers we can engage with. We can understand that choices are being made, even if we don't know sort of exactly what the original choice was or what it was in reference to.
One of my favorite instances of showing this in action is, I have a podcast based on an event series that I do at Wesleyan called The Critic and Her Publics. And on the second episode of that podcast, I had the critic Sophie Pinkham come to speak with me about how she writes about and thinks about contemporary Russian and Ukrainian literature. And I gave her two different translations of a poem by Mandelstam to look at. And I think for many of the students who were in the audience that night, and for many people just listening to the podcast, it was something they hadn't done before. Just take two translations of the same thing and put them side by side and think about how these are completely different kinds of artifacts, completely different objects that have been produced by different minds, different hands, and that are producing different aesthetic reactions in their readers. So I'm glad to hear that you do that. I think it's such a revelatory exercise, even if you're someone who knows all of this, just seeing it.
Yeah. Yeah, we bring it into the classroom when one of the other early works we read is the Book of Genesis, and that's a kind of bring your own moment with this problem, because we have students in the classroom who can read it in the original and are used to reading it in the original, and we have students in the classroom who are used to reading a very particular translation that comes out of their faith tradition or their cultural tradition, and we have students in the classroom who've never read it before, and that's, I think, the virtue of the first year seminar is that we can kind of stage this together. But let's get back to Sappho. One of the things we do in this class is we actually read the poetry together. So if we were going to look at some Sappho, where would you like to start?
Oh gosh, I think I would like to start. Why don't we start with fragment 1? Do you want to alternate stanzas, or should I just read the whole thing?
That sounds great.
Okay, you want to start, or should I?
Sure, I'll start. Deathless Aphrodite of the spangled mind, child of Zeus who twists lures, I beg you do not break with hard pains, O lady, my heart.
But come here, if ever before you caught my voice far off, and listening left your father's golden house and came.
Yoking your car, and fine birds brought you, quick sparrows over the black earth, whipping their wings down the sky through midair.
They arrived, but you, O blessed one, smiled in your deathless face and asked, what? Now again, I have suffered, and why? Now again, I am calling out.
And what I want to happen, most of all, in my crazy heart. Whom should I persuade, now again, to lead you back into her love? Who, O Sappho, is wronging you?
For if she flees, soon she will pursue. If she refuses gifts, rather will she give them. If she does not love, soon she will love, even unwilling.
Come to me now, loose me from hard care, and all my heart longs to accomplish. You be my ally.
That's great. So, I'm thinking about what I said a little bit earlier about the juxtaposition between a fragment like this, which feels complete, even if it's not, but is longer. There's an evenness to all of the stanzas. There is a thought that begins and that seems to end when the fragment itself ends. So there's a distinction between fragments like this one and something that comes sort of shortly after, say, I don't know, fragment 8, which is just bracket, bracket, Athis for you, bracket, bracket. So that's just the first thing that I would kind of draw students' attention to, that we begin with something that feels in its way recognizable to us. It is not forbidding in the same way that some of these other fragments are. And so I think our spangled minds can go to work quite readily on it. I am not a classicist. I do not know what the conventions of translation are. And I will say that as a critic reading this, the first thing that strikes me is the invocation at the beginning to deathless Aphrodite. And you and I talked a little bit offline about the convention of using the term deathless to translate, the deathless gods in Emily Wilson's translation of the Iliad. But here it was so striking to me because I expected the invocation to begin not with deathless, but with immortal. And there was something so interesting to me immediately about the literalism of it, that the gods are those without death, which seems to me somehow more forceful, somehow more violent to bring up that spectacle of death immediately in the invocation. So that just leaps out at me immediately. And you can tell me more a little bit about the convention of translation and whether I'm making too much of it. But as a non-specialist, that is the first thing that comes to me.
Yeah, I mean, this is as a classics professor, I could easily like clear the table and we could do 20 minutes on Greek and the conventions here. And I mean, one of the great things I love about this edition is that you can look across, and even if you don't read Greek, you can pretty easily find in that first line the word that means deathless. It's the one that comes right before the word that's clearly Aphrodite with the capital Alpha. And I'll try to get this up on the screen for this, but it's Athanata. And students of Freud and others might be aware that the Greek word for death is thanatos. And in ancient Greek, you can slap an alpha on the front of a word and mean that something lacks that thing. So someone who is athanata or athanatos, they are without the capacity or potential to die. I actually think deathless is maybe the best translation. They are undying. Immortal is actually the Latin word that most closely renders this particular idea. So we read Homer in Lattimore's Iliad and Wilson's Odyssey. And I think we determined through some word searching that Wilson uses deathless pretty regularly. And I just confirmed that Lattimore does not use the word ever in his translation of the Iliad. He uses the word immortal all the time. The only place I could find deathless in the book was in a footnote. So it's like in his mind when he's thinking about what the Greek says, but it's not a choice that he made when he went to render it.
So,
Yeah.
well, I mean, but here's where the philological and the aesthetic link up so beautifully, I
Yeah.
think, right? That we can actually create, that you and I can create a kind of a genealogy of the word deathless in these translations that you're reading for the class, and we can think about why in a particular context and in this fragment, right, deathless might be a preferable translation to immortal. And I think it has to do with the if we want to just scale up for a moment, I do think it has something to do with the way that Sappho thinks about Eros, and thinks about how Eros is for her, and we see this in other fragments, thinks about how eros at its most intense, desire at its most feverish, is a kind of death in life. It's an emptying out of the self. It's a state of ecstasy where you see yourself as if from outside yourself. And she writes about this beautifully, and Carson writes about this too, I think a little bit later on in fragment 31, that the state of ecstasy in eros is a state of being outside of your body, looking down or looking across at it. And there's a correspondence here between deathless Aphrodite, the idea of immortality, an endless life as being a kind of death, a death in life, and what it is that we experience when we are in the absolute throes of desire. So to me, there's this wonderful way to link up the philological choice, the alpha thanatos, with the overall idea of eros that we're getting here.
I'll just throw in a little kind of life hack for our students here. I'm always happy to answer my students' questions about what the Greek says or the Latin says. I never want to give the impression that that's a kind of knowledge you need to have in order to engage with the text. But one of the things that your university library card gets you access to is the Oxford English Dictionary online. And this, speaking of philology, this is one of my favorite philological exercises. Anytime you encounter a word in something you're reading in English, if you put it into the Oxford English Dictionary, you will immediately get 700 years of history of that word appearing in English that can help sort of start the wheels turning for you about like what choice is made here. So I would encourage everyone to use their new Columbia Library account to go see what the OED says about the history of the word deathless. The point you just made, though, about eros and the intensity of it and the nature of it makes me want to ask you about the idea of eros and of love. Something we sometimes talk about in class when we start reading this is, well, what is the genre? What kind of literature are we reading? And sometimes we'll talk about lyric, which is sort of the formal category of poetry that we classify this. And lyric is both, I think, a modern category and an ancient category. And there's an etymology to that, poetry to be sung to the lyre, which is like a guitar. But I think the other thing that I often have people say when they come into class on the first day after reading this is that they're reading love poetry. Um, is that a kind of operative term for us? What do we get when we think that this is poetry about love?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. I mean, there's a kind of philosophical debate among people who write about love over whether there is a distinction between love and eros. I think many of our ideas about eros probably in the modern world come to us from Freud, who used that term in a very loose sense. It could really mean everything from the kinds of connective energies that bind us together in civilization to explicitly sexual desire. And so there's a real looseness to the term eros that makes it possible for it to encapsulate both sort of sexual desire and spiritual love. And you guys also read the symposium, so you know that the distinctions between the bodily and the sensual and the spiritual, and whether those can or can't be integrated, is so important for Plato, and particularly important to Socrates's description of what he learns from the wise woman Diotima. I do not think of this as love poetry, and I don't think of it as love poetry because I think that there is a kind of simultaneous emotional intensity and delicacy to this poetry that makes it distinctively erotic.
We've talked a lot about love and eros here. How about the texture of the text itself.
Yeah, so what immediately leaps out to me in the fourth and fifth stanza that we read are those repeated parentheticals. And because I look over at the Greek and I see no indication of parentheses, and because I don't know whether in the Greek there would be an indication of parentheses, I immediately go to my notes and I read Carson's note where she tells us that the parentheses are not Sappho's, that she has introduced them. So one thing I always tell my own students when we're reading anything, whether it's a translator's introduction or it's an author writing autobiographically about why they decided to do something in a novel or in a poem, I always tell them to never, ever, ever take the author's word for it. And that the text might actually be doing something different from what the author tells us the text is doing. So when I see these parentheses and when I see their insertion, I think immediately of Carson's claim in her introduction that she's just kind of standing aside and letting Sappho speak for us. But I think the addition of these parentheses and the repetition of them now again, now again, now again, is obviously the translator exercising her right and her discretion in patterning this fragment in a way that the original does not pattern it. So why are these parentheses here is the next question that we might want to ask. They come immediately after questions that are being asked. But you, O Blessed One, smiled in your deathless face and asked, what? Now again I have suffered, and why? Now again I am calling out, and what I want to happen most of all in my crazy heart. Whom should I persuade now again to lead you back into her love? And so the repetition in the parentheses of now again is itself pointing to a bigger kind of repetition, that these are questions that the speaker has asked deathless Aphrodite before. What have I suffered? Why? And whom should I persuade to lead you back into her love? So there's two kinds of repetitions happening here, right? There's the textual repetition, but then there's also the idea that we fall in and out of love repeatedly. And that every time we do, we tend to ask the same kinds of questions, whether we address them to the deathless gods or to our friends or to ourselves. And one of the things that I find fascinating about these fragments is that there's so much we don't know. We don't know to whom they're addressed. We don't know if their scene of address is to somebody particular or if there is a kind of generic quality to them. And I think that what that now again, now again, now again reminds us is that the structure of Eros, like the structure of love, always feels intensely particular. It's about that person. For all of us, it's a particular person. And it's more or less generic. I think everybody sort of falls in love or feels desire in a similar kind of way. There's a similar pull. There's what Sappho describes in a later fragment as a sweet, bitter quality to Eros that I think is more or less, or she would insist, is more or less universal.
That universality is something that comes up every year in my classes when we read Sappho. I think pretty invariably every year, at least one student comes in the first day that we've looked at this poetry, excited because there's one poem that has spoken to them with a experience that they recognize immediately as one of desire and longing. And it's poem 31. Every year there's a student who's like holding this poem up and going, this is me.
Well, because poem 31, let's go back and
Yeah.
forth again. Yeah, I'll start this time.
Okay.
He seems to me equal to gods, that man, whoever he is, who opposite you sits and listens close to your sweet speaking.
And lovely laughing. Oh, it puts the heart in my chest on wings, for when I look at you, even a moment. No speaking is left in me,
No, tongue breaks and thin fire is racing under skin, and in eyes no sight, and drumming fills ears.
and cold sweat holds me, and shaking grips me all, greener than grass. I am and dead, or almost, I seem to me.
But all is to be dared, because even a person of poverty, and then it stops. Of course they hold this up, because they hold this up the same reason when I teach Swan in Love, the kind of little novella that's sometimes excerpted from the first volume of Proust's In Search of Lost Time. My students are like, oh my God, sexual jealousy, what a ubiquitous feeling. And of course, this is what this fragment is presenting to us. It's presenting the classic love triangle. Um, we have the speaker and observer who is sitting and watching a man who is speaking to the person that she loves. And that setup, I think, is probably familiar to almost anybody by the time they're 18 years old and entering college.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Carson, has a really beautiful gloss on this on this fragment in an essay that appears in her book Decreation. I would recommend that everybody read it. You can find it online, and it's really quite short, maybe only 1,000 words or so. But what she is interested in is the 17th line, where the fragment seems to break off and a new kind of thought seems to begin. But all is to be dared, because even a person of poverty, well, even a person of poverty, what, right? You're on the edge of your seat.
Yeah.
There feels like there's like some great unfairness in that thought not being completed for you. And what Carson does is she goes back up and she reads the stanza before it. And cold sweat holds me and shaking grips me, greener than grass. I am and dead, or almost I seem to me. Uh, I am and dead, or almost I seem to me. All of a sudden, that perception, the speaker's perception, what seems to her switches from the man who is speaking to her beloved. He seems to me equal to God's,
Um,
to herself, I seem to me. And she seems to be seeing herself from the outside in the same way that she's seeing that man. And Carson's reading of this switch uh, is that what love dares us to do, uh, it what it dares us to imagine is a kind of ecstatic state wherein we are actually outside of ourselves,
mhm,
uh, and we dare to be nothing.
mhm.
We dare to be dead, or almost, in this kind of state of ecstasy that Eros leads us to.
Something that speaks to me about that is the way that there's this kind of um, uh, sort of this golden chain of reconstruction that is never done. That these fragments come out of the ground on scraps of papyrus. They come out of a confused and messy transmission, and the textual critics put them together, and the translator decides how to translate them. But there's no way to finish this poem. We're I mean, maybe we would dig it up someday. There is this question mark here, and yet the work of filling in that gap is not just the work of digging up some new scrap of papyrus. It's interpretive work. It's interpretive work that, in that essay, Carson is explaining how we can do, and that's a kind of, we can like take that torch from her, and we're always doing that. We're always filling in the gaps as readers.
Yeah, I mean, there's also a really interesting connection here to the philosophy of desire and its distinction from love, right? Which is that people would say that desire ultimately is about lack.
Yeah,
That
exactly.
we can never feel the kind of completion that we
Yeah.
want to feel. And the minute we feel that completion, that is when the diminution of desire begins.
Hmm.
And so these are poems about desire, about longing. That's the other word that repeats, right? About longing. And their own state of incompleteness is, I think, kind of wonderfully analogous to the incompleteness or the lack that they are always, always, always testifying to. And the delicacy of that lack. That one thing that would ruin these poems is if Carson's hermeneutics were really aggressive. And
Mhm.
what's great about that essay in Decreation, when she's talking about it, is she's very willing to admit to her own unknowing. So she says, I can't pretend to know what line 17 really means. I can't pretend to fill out the thought and give you a kind of perfectly rounded answer to this question I'm asking. And that unknowingness is part of that lack, and it's part of the energy of desire.
I can't think of a more important lesson I would want students to carry into this class with them than you don't need to pretend that you know. You know, I think that is actually vital to the pose that we try to adopt as critics and readers here. With our remaining few minutes, I want to pivot to just a different aspect of Sappho as a poet. And one of the things that we struggle to escape when we have a class whose reading list, whose syllabus sort of has its origins in a transmitted canon of like all the surviving ancient Greek literature, is that very few of the surviving authors in that tradition are women. What we have is largely a canon of men, and it's hard to thus avoid putting on Sappho in this class the great weight of being, the woman poet, one of the few surviving named women authors from Greek antiquity. But to talk about that, I wonder if you could tell us again a story you once told me about a course you teach at Wesleyan called Practical Criticism, and an exercise you do in that course around poetry and the gender of the author.
Yeah, it's actually the structure of the whole course is based on a class that the great critic I.A. Richards taught at Cambridge in the 1920s, where he would hand his, every week at the end of class, he would hand his students a poem. It would have no author name, no title, no date of publication. And they were supposed to take the poem home and read it as many times as they wanted to, and then write what Richards called a protocol, where they would both evaluate the poem aesthetically, they would judge it, and they would interpret it. And I.A. Richards kept all of his students' protocols, and he uses them as the basis for his book on practical criticism. And if you ever, I mean, maybe another very minor life hack or something I would want every freshman to think about. If you ever think your professor is being mean to you, go read what I.A. Richards wrote about his students in practical criticism, just to put things in perspective. Um, but so I teach a course structured exactly like this. And last year we had 13 weeks in the semester, so there were 13 poems. Every single one of them was written by a woman, and I think almost every single one spoken by a woman, in ways that if you knew to think about the gender of the author would have been relatively obvious to you. And I should just say, for students, I'm distinguishing between the identified gender of the person who wrote the poem and the gender of the speaker of the poem itself, because I think that differentiation is often important. But in this case, it actually was interestingly unimportant to my students, whose guiding assumption for every single poem that I gave them was that both author and speaker were a man in every single case. And in some of these cases, it wasn't that surprising. It was interesting to think about how gender was or wasn't marked in a poem. And in other cases, it seemed to me so obviously marked, that it almost seemed like a willful misreading to insist on the gender of the speaker or the author as male. And so those instances were things where, for instance, Margaret Cavendish in a poem from the mid-17th century, opens her poem with the line, "I language want to dress my fancies in." And then there's a kind of extended metaphor about dressing up your language by curling its hair and putting on a spangled ball gown of fine silks. And all of the language is the language of a highly kind of feminized dress. So that was surprising to me. Or a poem by Gwendolyn Brooks, where the speaker is in bed describing the body of her male lover and its effect on her. That was surprising to me. So to me, the question of gender is, one, does it matter? Does it matter for our judgment of the poem, our aesthetic judgment of the poem? Does it matter for our interpretations of the poem? And does it matter for a recreation of the historical context in which the poem or from which the poem or the fragment is emerging? And again, these are massively complicated questions, and I wouldn't pretend to have any definitive answer. It would be dangerous, I think, to have a definitive answer to these kinds of questions. But like reading Sappho, I don't know that it matters to me what the gender here is, in part because the whole idea of the subject, like the individual subject, is already so destroyed by Eros that gender seems just sort of incidental. And I think we see this in, one of my favorite fragments, which is 130, which is very, very short. And it just goes, "Eros, the melter of limbs, now again stirs me." And there's that "now again" in parentheses. "Eros, the melter of limbs, now again stirs me, sweet, bitter, unmanageable creature who steals in." And I love that because, right, it's like Eros melts your limbs. It takes away your human form now again, over and over again. It makes you something inhuman, and it steals into you, and you become this kind of sweet, bitter, unmanageable creature.
Hmm.
And so the logic of Eros is a kind of inhuman, creatural logic. It gets us closer to animals than to people, and animals I don't think have strong conceptions of gender. um, so to me, the gender question is interestingly dissolved in Sappho.
Uh, you mentioned when we started talking that you had been asked to interview Anne Carson once and had tried to read everything you could about her. Do you want to talk about how the interview went?
Not well. I mean, she didn't. God, it's the only like unsuccessful interview I think I've ever done. It was never published, and it basically just stopped. But she didn't want to meet in person. She just wanted to do it over email. And when you read, when you're interviewing someone, I think the to use a slightly psychoanalytic term, like there's so much transference going on there between the interviewer and the interviewee. And as the interviewer, you're always anxious about wanting to be the best of all the interviewers, right? And so you're always trying to think, like, how can I do this in an interesting way? How can I ask a question that's never been asked before? And somewhat mortifyingly, knowing that Anne Carson is also a fan of Emily Dickinson, she writes a lot about Emily Dickinson, and Emily Dickinson is also a poet of fragments. Her envelope poems are some of the most beautiful poems on love that I've ever read. I sent Anne Carson an envelope poem that a man had once sent to me after this man and I had decided to no longer speak to one another. And I basically asked her why he had sent it to me, and I asked her to perform a kind of interpretation of it, and she just didn't respond for about a month. And then I really sheepishly followed up, and she was like, "I don't know what you want from me."
Oh,
And it was just like, romantic rejection. It had that same like horrible, embarrassing feeling of romantic rejection. But it also kind of reminded me that, you know, the whole project in a book like this is about not over speaking
mm,
where there are silences. So what was I looking for from her? I was looking for an interpretation of someone else's behavior. How could she possibly have given that to me? So it was actually completely an appropriate response, and it was a sort of like misstep on my part in an attempt to be creative. But yeah.
I often feel reading Sappho that like the universality of experience that Sappho accesses and that Carson makes available causes this to be one of those books where I feel like it is or has the potential to be like a Rosetta Stone for human experience. Like I could just keep reading it and find an explanation of anything I need explained in my own life.
Yeah, well, or the temptation is to see the author themselves as a kind of prophet,
Right.
as if you could just, lay this down at their feet and they could solve all of your problems. All of
Mhm.
your all of your romantic dilemmas could suddenly be resolved. And I think that was the mistake that I think that was the mistake that I made.
Yeah,
So
and
don't
I,
do that. Life hack. Another, as long as we're giving life hacks, use the OED. Don't do what I
Henry
did. Yeah.
Richards, don't do with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I had to kind of metabolize that into something kind of for the student or for the classroom, it might be that um, I certainly came out of high school thinking that books had all the answers in them, and my job as a student was to get them all out and bring them to my instructor. And I think one of the things I learned as a university student was just how much more I'm actually capable of and sort of like responsible for locating, right? I actually don't need the book to explain everything to me. I need to learn how to explain things to myself
Yeah.
at a certain point.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing I would just say is the great benefit of explaining things to yourself is that I do think that a book like this helps us understand, even from its great kind of historical distance and its occasionally forbidding aesthetic stance, does just help us understand feelings that we will ourselves experience throughout our lives, and maybe most intensely in college. And so the great value of taking responsibility for it is I do think it makes you a better reader of some of those feelings when you have them yourself. And you can just, walk around explaining to all of your friends your sweet, bitter melting of limbs.
Well, Merve Emre, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us about this. Merve Emre is a professor at Wesleyan, the author of most recently the annotated Mrs. Dalloway, mentioning that because we read Virginia Woolf in this class, and
Coming,
working on. Go ahead.
right? And
Huh?
I'm coming to talk to you guys about Virginia.
You'll be coming to talk to my instructors about Virginia Woolf in the spring. That's right. And you're also working on this book, Love and Other Useless Pursuits, which I think is probably going to have a lot to say about a lot of the things we read in this class as well. So
So
thanks
thanks
so
for
much for
having
your
me.
time.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks.